I'm Dr. Amara Johnson, 43 years old, and 3 years ago, an incident happened at the university where I was pursuing my doctorate that changed everything. My white roommate called campus security on me while I was studying in our shared graduate housing, claiming she felt unsafe because I was having what she called a loud phone conversation with my thesis advisor at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. But what the dean of student affairs did next was even worse. If you've ever experienced racism in academic settings, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this struggle. Let me take you back to how I got to that moment because my story didn't start with that racist incident. It started with a little girl in Birmingham, Alabama, who learned early that education was both a weapon and a shield. My grandmother, Mama Ruth, used to say, "Baby girl, they can take a lot from you, but they can't take what's in your head." She'd been a teacher during segregation, teaching black children in overcrowded classrooms with hand-me-down books, and she instilled in me that knowledge was power, but also that power had to be wielded carefully when you look like us. Growing up, Sunday dinners at Mama Ruth's house were like graduate seminars in survival. While we passed around her famous mac and cheese and cornbread, the adults would discuss everything from local politics to strategies for navigating predominantly white institutions. My father, a mechanic who'd earned his GED at 35, would listen to these conversations with the intensity of someone studying for finals. My mother, a nurse who'd fought to become head of her department, would share stories about code switching and the exhausting performance of being twice as good to get half as much. These weren't just family dinners, they were masterclasses in resilience, strategic thinking, and community wisdom that would later save my life. By the time I graduated high school as valedictorian, I understood that my achievements weren't just personal victories, they were community investments. The church had taken up collections to help with my college applications. Mrs. Henderson from down the street had driven me to interviews. Coach Williams had spent hours helping me prepare for scholarship meetings, teaching me how to speak about my accomplishments without seeming threatening to white evaluators. When I got that full scholarship to Emory University, it felt like the whole neighborhood had won something together. But college was where I first learned the difference between being smart and being the only black woman in most of my classes. I majored in public health with a minor in African American studies, partly because I genuinely loved the work and partly because those AAS classes were the only spaces where I could breathe fully, where my intelligence wasn't questioned or over scrutinized, where I could reference my community's wisdom without being told it wasn't academic enough. Professor Williams, one of the few black faculty members, became my mentor not just academically but culturally. She taught me how to navigate academic conferences where I might be the only black face in a sea of hundreds, how to respond to compliments about how articulate I was, and how to build networks with other scholars of color who could become lifelong collaborators and friends. The real education happened in the spaces between classes, learning to modulate my voice in study groups so I wouldn't be labeled aggressive, figuring out how to disagree with professors without being seen as difficult, mastering the art of making white classmates comfortable with my presence while never diminishing myself. I excelled academically, graduating summa cum laude, but the social navigation was exhausting in ways that my white peers never had to consider. Every interaction felt like a performance where the stakes were higher for me than for anyone else. After undergrad, I spent 5 years working in public health policy for the Georgia Department of Health, where I specialized in maternal mortality disparities, work that was both personally meaningful and professionally strategic. I knew that black women were dying at alarming rates during childbirth, and I wanted to use research and policy to save lives that look like mine, like my mother's, like my future daughters. The work was challenging but rewarding, and I built a reputation as someone who could translate complex research into actionable policy recommendations. Those 5 years taught me how to work within systems that weren't designed for people like me. I learned to document everything, to build coalitions across racial lines, and to present my ideas in ways that didn't threaten white colleagues who might feel defensive about racism in healthcare. I published research papers, presented at national conferences, and built relationships with legislators who actually listened when I spoke about health disparities. By the time I decided to pursue my doctorate, I had credibility, experience, and a clear vision for how I wanted to use advanced research training to make even bigger changes. I chose to pursue my PhD in epidemiology at the University of North Carolina because of their strong program in health disparities research and because Dr. Patricia Moore, a renowned black epidemiologist, had agreed to serve as my advisor. The decision to go back to school at 39 wasn't easy. I was giving up a stable salary, good benefits, and the comfort of being established in my field. But I knew that if I wanted to make the kind of systemic changes that could actually save Black women's lives, I needed the credentials and research training that only a doctoral program could provide. The first 2 years of my program went smoothly. I was older than most of my cohort, more experienced, and I'd learned enough about academic politics to navigate departmental dynamics successfully. My research was progressing well. I was conducting a multi-state analysis of factors contributing to maternal mortality disparities, work that had already generated interest from major public health organizations. Dr. Moore was an excellent advisor, and I'd built good relationships with other faculty members and graduate students. I felt confident, capable, and optimistic about my future. Living in graduate housing made financial sense, and I'd been matched with Sarah Mitchell, a 24-year-old white doctoral student in psychology. Our living arrangement had been cordial, if not particularly warm. We shared common areas respectfully, split household duties fairly, and generally stayed out of each other's way. I spent most of my time either in the lab, the library, or traveling for research, so our interaction was minimal but pleasant enough. The foundation I'd built over decades, the community support, the professional credibility, the academic achievements, the careful navigation of predominantly white spaces, all of that seemed solid and secure. I had tenure-track job interviews lined up for the following year. My dissertation research was groundbreaking, and I felt like I was finally approaching the moment when all those years of strategic patience and excellence would pay off in the form of real institutional power to create change. But what I didn't fully understand yet was how quickly that foundation could be shaken by someone who saw my very presence as a threat, and how institutions I'd learned to trust could reveal their true nature when forced to choose between protecting someone who looked like me and someone who looked like them. The signs were there, I just hadn't learned to read them yet. Looking back now, I can see the cultural foundation that carried me through what was about to happen, but I couldn't have predicted how severely it would all be tested. My family had prepared me for individual racism, but not for the sophisticated way that institutions could weaponize their authority to protect racist behavior while appearing reasonable and professional. Growing up in the Johnson family meant understanding that we carried the hopes and dreams of generations who'd been denied opportunities that we might take for granted. My great-grandmother had cleaned white folks' houses to send my grandmother to college. My grandmother had taught in segregated schools to ensure my mother could become a nurse. My mother had worked double shifts to make sure I could focus on my studies without worrying about money. Each generation had sacrificed so that the next could climb higher, and with that inheritance came responsibility, not just to succeed, but to succeed in ways that opened doors for others following behind us. The cultural lessons were woven into everyday life. Sunday church services at Mount Olive Baptist weren't just about worship, they were community strategy sessions where deacons who worked in white-collar jobs would quietly mentor young people about navigating professional environments, where women's auxiliaries shared information about which schools and employers were more welcoming to Black students and workers, where the pastor's sermons connected biblical principles to contemporary struggles for justice and dignity. Church wasn't separate from survival, it was central to it. Family reunions were master classes in code switching and cultural competence. I watched my older cousins move seamlessly between discussing their corporate jobs in standard English and then switching to African American vernacular when telling family stories, observed how they maintained their authentic selves while adapting to different professional contexts. Uncle Jerome, who'd become the first Black partner at his law firm, would spend hours with the younger generation teaching us about professional networking, appropriate interview attire, and how to handle racist microaggressions with grace and strategic thinking. But the most important lesson was about community accountability. Success wasn't just personal, it was communal. When I got my bachelor's degree, it was celebrated not just by my immediate family, but by church members who'd watched me grow up, by teachers who'd invested in my potential, by neighbors who'd seen something special and wanted to be part of nurturing it. That celebration came with expectations that I'd use my achievements to lift others, that I'd remember where I came from, and that I'd never forget that my individual success was built on collective investment and sacrifice. Professional spaces were where I learned to apply these cultural lessons practically. In my early career at the Georgia Department of Health, I was often the only Black woman in meetings with legislators, department heads, and research directors. I'd learned to dress impeccably, not just professionally, but in ways that commanded respect and deflected assumptions about my competence. I mastered the art of speaking with authority while never appearing threatening, of presenting research findings that expose racist health disparities without making white colleagues defensive enough to dismiss the evidence. Dr. Moore had taught me that academic success required cultural intelligence as much as intellectual ability. You have to be fluent in multiple languages, she told me during one of our mentoring sessions. You need to speak research methodology, policy analysis, academic politics, and community advocacy, sometimes all in the same conversation. But never forget that your community's wisdom is just as valuable as anything you'll learn in graduate school. The academy needs what we bring, even when it doesn't want to admit it. The racism that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I'd been working on my dissertation for hours, making excellent progress on data analysis, when Dr. Moore called to discuss some exciting preliminary findings. We were both excited about the implications of what I was discovering, clear evidence that structural racism in healthcare settings was directly contributing to maternal mortality disparities, data that could influence policy at the national level. Our conversation was animated and professional, but I was speaking with the enthusiasm that comes from breakthrough research moments. We discussed methodological approaches, debated interpretation of statistical significance, and planned next steps for publication. I was sitting in the common area of our apartment because I'd spread my materials across the large table and the lighting was better for the detailed charts and graphs I was reviewing. About 30 minutes into the call, Sarah emerged from her room. I smiled and waved as I always did when we encountered each other and continued my conversation with Dr. Moore. We were discussing the implications of our findings for emergency department protocols when I noticed Sarah standing near the kitchen, clearly listening to my conversation. She had an expression I couldn't quite read, something between confusion and disapproval. When I finished the call, Sarah approached me with a tone I'd never heard from her before. "That conversation seemed really intense," she said. "You were talking pretty loudly about some heavy stuff. It made me feel uncomfortable." I explained that I'd been discussing my dissertation research with my advisor and apologized if I'd been too loud. But something in her response, the way she said uncomfortable, the way she seemed to be evaluating my explanation, set off alarm bells that my grandmother's training had taught me to recognize. Later that evening, while I was in my room reading, I heard Sarah on the phone with someone. Her voice was deliberately low, but our walls were thin, and I could make out fragments. "Feels unsafe, loud and aggressive, discussing really violent stuff about black women dying. I don't know what to do. Maybe I should call someone." The realization hit me like ice water. She was describing our interaction to someone, but in a way that painted my professional conversation with my advisor as somehow threatening or dangerous. I spent that night documenting everything I could remember about our interaction, writing down exact quotes, noting times and dates. Something my mother had taught me: when you're dealing with racist people, paper trails can save your life. Write everything down because they'll lie and you need to be ready to prove the truth. The next morning, I woke up to campus security officers knocking on our door. Sarah answered, and I heard her say, "Yes, that's her." I called because I felt unsafe last night. She was having this really aggressive conversation about violence against black women, and I thought someone should check on the situation. The officers asked to speak with me. They were professional, but clearly treating the situation as a potential threat assessment. I explained that I'd been discussing my doctoral research with my thesis advisor, showed them my research materials, and provided Dr. Moore's contact information for verification. But the damage was done. My white roommate had successfully weaponized campus security against me for the crime of being a black woman having an academic conversation in my own living space. What happened next revealed how institutions protect racism while maintaining plausible deniability. The officers filed a report documenting Sarah's complaint and my explanation, but framed it as a roommate conflict rather than a false report motivated by racial bias. The report would become part of my student record, despite the fact that I'd done nothing wrong and had broken no rules or policies. When I met with the Dean of Student Affairs to address what had happened, I expected support, understanding, and action to prevent future incidents. Instead, I encountered a masterclass in institutional gaslighting that would teach me everything I needed to know about how universities protect racist behavior while appearing to care about diversity and inclusion. Dean Patricia Walsh was a middle-aged white woman who'd built her career on diversity initiatives and inclusive excellence programs. Her office was decorated with photos from cultural events, awards for promoting equity, and books about social justice that looked like they'd never been opened. She listened to my account of events with what appeared to be concerned attention, taking notes and nodding sympathetically. But when I finished speaking, her response revealed everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. "I understand this was distressing for you," she said, "but we have to consider all perspectives here." Sarah felt genuinely concerned for her safety, and we take all safety reports seriously. "Perhaps there are ways we can help both of you communicate more effectively going forward." The word safety hung in the air like a weapon. Sarah, a white woman, had felt unsafe because I, a black woman, had been having an academic conversation with my professor about my research. and the institution was treating her manufactured fear as equally valid as my experience of being targeted by racist assumptions and weaponized campus security. With respect, Dean Walsh, I replied, this wasn't a communication issue, this was racial profiling. My roommate called security on me for having a professional conversation with my thesis advisor about my doctoral research. There was no threat, no violation of any policy, no rational basis for feeling unsafe. This was racism, pure and simple. Dean Walsh's demeanor shifted slightly, her sympathetic expression replaced by something more guarded. That's a very serious accusation, she said. We can't just assume that racial bias was involved without clear evidence. It's possible this was simply a misunderstanding between two people with different communication styles and comfort levels. And there it was, the institutional protection of racism disguised as fairness, the false equivalency that treated my factual account of discrimination as just one subjective perspective among many, the suggestion that being racially profiled in my own home was somehow my fault for having the wrong communication style. I left that meeting understanding that the University of North Carolina, despite all its diversity rhetoric and inclusion initiatives, would not protect me from racism. Worse, it would actively participate in gaslighting me about my own experiences, forcing me to question whether what I knew to be true was actually true, whether my grandmother's warnings about how institutions protect whiteness even when they claim to value diversity had been correct all along. But I also left that meeting with something else, clarity about what I was dealing with, and determination to document everything that happened next. Because if the institution thought it could make me disappear quietly, it was about to learn that I came from people who'd been fighting these battles for generations, and I had no intention of going anywhere. The gaslighting began immediately and systematically. Dean Walsh scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next week, ostensibly to develop a plan for moving forward constructively. I arrived prepared with documentation of the incident, research about racial bias in campus security calls, and specific recommendations for addressing what had happened. The meeting took place in her office, but this time she wasn't alone. She'd invited Dr. Richard Hayes, the Associate Dean for Student Life, and Maria Santos, a counselor from Student Support Services. The setup felt like an intervention designed to overwhelm me with institutional authority rather than address the racist incident I'd reported. We've been thinking about your situation, Dean Walsh began, and we believe the best approach would be to focus on healing and moving forward, rather than assigning blame or making this more adversarial than it needs to be. Dr. Hayes nodded along, his expression conveying the kind of practiced concern that administrators use when they want to appear caring while avoiding accountability. I responded directly, Dean Walsh, what happened wasn't a situation that requires healing, it was racial discrimination that requires corrective action. My roommate made a false report to campus security based on racist assumptions about me. That's not a conflict to be resolved through mediation. It's a civil rights violation that needs to be addressed through your bias incident protocols. Maria Santos, the counselor, leaned forward with what was clearly a rehearsed intervention. I understand you're feeling frustrated and hurt, she said, but sometimes when we're experiencing stress from academic pressures, we can interpret neutral situations as more threatening than they actually are. Graduate school is challenging for everyone, and sometimes that stress can make us more sensitive to interpersonal conflicts. The audacity was breathtaking. They were suggesting that being racially profiled by my roommate and then gaslit by administrators was actually me misinterpreting neutral situations due to academic stress. They were pathologizing my accurate perception of racism as a psychological problem that needed counseling rather than an institutional problem that needed fixing. Let me be clear, I said, keeping my voice steady despite my rising anger. I am not experiencing academic stress. I am not misinterpreting neutral situations. I am not being overly sensitive. I am a 39-year-old professional with 15 years of experience working in predominantly white institutions. I know the difference between interpersonal conflict and racial discrimination. My roommate called campus security on me for having a professional conversation about my research. That is not stress or sensitivity, that is racism. Dr. Hayes finally spoke up. We appreciate your perspective, Miss Johnson, but we also have to consider that intent matters. Sarah has assured us that she had no racial motivations. She was genuinely concerned about what she perceived as an escalating situation. Sometimes these misunderstandings happen when people from different backgrounds have different communication styles. There it was again, the suggestion that racism only counts if the perpetrator admits to racial intent. the idea that my communication style was somehow responsible for triggering Sarah's racist assumptions, the institutional protection of a white woman's manufactured fear over a black woman's actual experience of discrimination, different communication styles. I repeated, Dr. Hayes, I was discussing statistical significance and methodological approaches with my thesis advisor. What communication style issue could possibly make that conversation seem threatening enough to warrant calling security? Please explain to me what about discussing maternal mortality research constitutes a different communication styles that would reasonably make someone feel unsafe. The room fell silent. None of them could answer that question because there was no answer that didn't expose the racist assumptions underlying Sarah's behavior and their protection of it. Dean Walsh broke the silence. We think the best path forward would be to arrange alternative housing for the remainder of the semester. That way, both you and Sarah can focus on your academic work without the stress of this ongoing tension. Alternative housing, I asked. You want me to move out of my assigned housing because my roommate made a false report to campus security based on racist assumptions. So your solution to someone experiencing racial discrimination is to displace the victim rather than address the perpetrator's behavior? We're trying to find a solution that works for everyone, Dr. Hayes said. Sarah is also feeling stressed about this situation, and we think some space would be beneficial for both of you. Maria Santos added, we could also connect you with some resources for processing these difficult feelings. Sometimes talking through these experiences with a professional can help us develop better strategies for navigating interpersonal challenges. I stood up. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. My white roommate racially profiled me and made a false report to campus security. Your response is to suggest that I move out, accept counseling to help me process as being discriminated against, and develop better strategies for navigating racism. Is that accurate? None of them answered directly, but their discomfort was obvious. Dean Walsh tried one more approach. We're really trying to find a resolution that allows everyone to move forward positively. We found that these kinds of conflicts often resolve more smoothly when we focus on healing rather than punishment. I gathered my materials and headed toward the door. This isn't a conflict, it's discrimination. And your refusal to name it accurately or address it appropriately tells me everything I need to know about this institution's actual commitment to protecting students who look like me. As I reached the door, Dr. Hayes called after me, Miss Johnson, we hope you'll consider our suggestions. We really do want to support your success here. I turned back to face them. If you wanted to support my success, you would investigate Sarah's false report, provide her with bias training, and ensure that this doesn't happen to other students of color. Instead, you're asking me to accept displacement and counseling as solutions to someone else's racism. That's not support, that's complicity. I left the meeting with absolute clarity about what I was dealing with. The university's diversity rhetoric was pure performance. When faced with clear racial discrimination, they would protect the white perpetrator, gaslight the black victim, and frame institutional racism as interpersonal conflict requiring therapy and displacement rather than accountability and correction. But I also left with something they didn't expect: a strategic plan. Because while they'd been busy trying to manage me, I'd been documenting everything, researching their policies, and preparing to use every tool at my disposal to ensure that this story had a very different ending than the one they'd scripted. That evening, I called Dr. Moore to update her on what had happened. They're following the classic playbook, she said: deny, deflect, and pathologize. But Amara, you're not the first student this has happened to, and you won't be the last unless someone makes them accountable. The question is, are you prepared for what fighting back is going to cost you? I thought about my grandmother's words, my community's investment in my success, and all the black women who come before me and face similar choices. Dr. Moore, I said, they picked the wrong person to try to gaslight. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not accepting their narrative about what happened here. Good, she replied, because I've been waiting for someone with your credentials and your backbone to take these people on. Let's start documenting everything and building a case they can't ignore. The retaliation began subtly, as institutional racism often does. Small changes in how I was treated that would be easy to dismiss individually but created a pattern of hostility that made my academic environment increasingly difficult to navigate. First, my access to research resources became mysteriously complicated. The statistical software I've been using for months suddenly required re-verification of my authorization, a process that somehow took 3 weeks and multiple meetings with IT support. When I tried to reserve time in the computer lab for data analysis, I was told that priority scheduling had changed and graduate students now needed faculty sponsor approval for extended computer time, a requirement that none of my peers seemed to be aware of or subjected to. My Carl in the graduate library, which I'd had for 2 years without issue, was suddenly needed for reorganization, and I was moved to a space in the basement that had poor lighting and no internet access. When I complained, the library staff explained that space assignments were under review and that my new location was temporary, but no timeline was provided for getting my original Carl back. The most damaging retaliation came through my academic relationships. Dr. Hayes had apparently reached out to faculty members in my department to make them aware of the housing situation I was experiencing. He framed it as providing support, but the effect was to plant seeds of doubt about my stability and professionalism among professors who might serve on my dissertation committee or write recommendation letters for job applications. Professor Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the dean, but equally committed to protecting institutional reputation, approached me after a departmental seminar with what she clearly thought was helpful advice. "I heard you've been having some adjustment difficulties," she said. "Graduate school can be stressful, especially for students who might not have the same background preparation as others. Have you considered whether this program is the right fit for you?" The condescension was staggering. I had been in the program for 3 years, had passed comprehensive exams with distinction, was conducting groundbreaking research on maternal mortality disparities, and had already been invited to present at multiple national conferences. But because I reported racial discrimination, I was suddenly being treated as if I were an underprepared student who might not belong in the program. "Professor Walsh," I replied, "I'm not experiencing adjustment difficulties. I'm experiencing retaliation for reporting racial discrimination. My academic performance has been excellent consistently, and my research is on track for completion according to my original timeline. What specific concerns do you have about my preparation or fit for this program?" She backpedaled quickly. "Oh, I didn't mean to imply anything about your academic abilities. I just know that interpersonal conflicts can be distracting, and I wanted to make sure you know that faculty are here to support you if you need to reconsider your options." "Reconsider my options?" I asked. "Are you suggesting I should leave the program because my roommate made a false report to campus security?" "Not at all," she said, though her discomfort was obvious. "I just want you to know that if you decided this environment wasn't the right fit, there are ways to transition gracefully that wouldn't reflect poorly on your record." Translation: they wanted me gone, and they were testing whether I could be pressured into leaving voluntarily rather than forcing them to take more aggressive action. I started noticing how differently I was being treated in classes and seminars. Professors who had previously engaged enthusiastically with my research questions began responding to my contributions with polite but distant acknowledgement. My peers, who had previously included me in study groups and social gatherings, became noticeably cooler in their interactions. The whisper network in my department was clearly carrying a narrative about me that painted me as difficult, unstable, or problematic. The most painful retaliation came when I learned that my teaching assistantship for the following semester had been restructured. Dr. Hayes called to inform me that budget constraints required reducing the number of TA positions and that priority would be given to students who were fully focused on their academic responsibilities without external distractions. "External distractions?" I asked. "What external distractions are you referring to?" "Well, we understand you've been dealing with some housing conflicts that have required administrative attention. We just want to make sure students who receive funding support are able to dedicate their full energy to their academic and teaching responsibilities." I was being financially punished for reporting racism. The loss of my TA position meant losing not just income, but also health insurance and professional teaching experience that was crucial for my job market competitiveness. They were systematically destroying my ability to complete my degree successfully while maintaining plausible deniability about their motivations. But the most insidious form of retaliation was the constant questioning of my perceptions and reactions. In every interaction with administrators, staff, and even some faculty, there was an underlying suggestion that I was overreacting, misinterpreting neutral situations, or bringing unnecessary drama to an otherwise harmonious academic environment. Maria Santos called to check in on my emotional well-being, asking questions that felt more like psychological evaluation than support. "Are you sleeping well? Have you been feeling more irritable than usual? Do you think your stress levels might be affecting how you interpret interactions with others?" Each question reinforced the narrative that my problem wasn't experiencing racism, but rather my psychological response to experiencing racism. Dean Walsh sent emails with subject lines like "resources for moving forward positively" that included links to stress management workshops, conflict resolution seminars, and counseling services. The message was clear: the problem was my inability to cope with interpersonal challenges, not the institution's failure to address discrimination. The gaslighting was sophisticated and relentless. Every time I tried to discuss what was happening, I was told that I was stuck in the past, unable to let go, or making things harder for yourself by dwelling on negative experiences. When I pointed out specific instances of retaliation, I was told that I was seeing patterns that aren't there or attributing normal administrative processes to malicious intent, but they underestimated both my documentation skills and my community connections. Every conversation was immediately written down with dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes. Every email was saved and backed up. Every policy change affecting me was cross-referenced with what other students were experiencing to establish patterns of discriminatory treatment. Dr. Moore was invaluable during this period, not just as an academic advisor, but as someone who could validate my experiences and help me maintain perspective. "They're trying to make you question your own sanity," she told me during one of our regular check-ins. "It's a classic strategy for dealing with people who threaten institutional narratives. They can't dispute what happened, so they're trying to make you doubt whether what happened was actually significant." More importantly, Dr. Moore connected me with other students and faculty of color who had experienced similar retaliation for reporting racist incidents. I learned that Sarah wasn't the first white student to make false security reports about Black roommates, that Dean Walsh had used the same healing and moving forward language with other discrimination victims, and that the pattern of academic and financial retaliation I was experiencing was well documented but never formally acknowledged by the administration. We began meeting monthly as an informal support group, sharing strategies for documentation, discussing legal options, and providing emotional support for each other as we navigated hostile academic environments. These connections were crucial for maintaining my sanity and my determination to fight back, because they confirmed that what I was experiencing wasn't isolated incidents but part of systematic institutional racism. The turning point came when Dr. Hayes called to inform me that my dissertation proposal defense, originally scheduled for the following month, would need to be postponed because one of my committee members had concerns about the current environment and felt it would be inappropriate to proceed while interpersonal conflicts remain unresolved. "Which committee member?" I asked. "I can't share that information," he replied, but they felt it would be better to wait until things settled down before moving forward with such an important milestone. That's when I knew they were prepared to sabotage my academic progress indefinitely. My dissertation proposal had been approved unanimously by my committee 6 months earlier. My research was proceeding according to timeline. There was no academic justification for delaying my defense. They were manufacturing obstacles to force me out of the program. I hung up the phone and immediately called the lawyer that Dr. Moore had recommended. It was time to stop playing defense and start going on the offensive, because this institution was about to learn that I hadn't spent 15 years navigating racist systems just to be defeated by their amateur hour retaliation campaign. The escalation came when the university decided that subtle retaliation wasn't working fast enough. If they couldn't pressure me into leaving voluntarily, they would create a justification for removing me involuntarily. What they did next was so brazen, so obviously fabricated, that it finally gave me the smoking gun evidence I needed to prove systematic discrimination. Dr. Hayes called me into his office for what he described as an urgent meeting regarding concerning behavior reports. I arrived to find him sitting with Dean Walsh and a woman I didn't recognize who introduced herself as Dr. Rebecca Chin from Student Psychological Services. "We've received multiple reports," Dean Walsh began, "about concerning interactions you've had with various community members. We're worried about your well-being and want to make sure you're getting the support you need." "What reports?" I asked. "What concerning interactions?" Dr. Hayes opened a file folder and began reading from what appeared to be prepared statements. "A staff member in the Graduate Student Services office reported that you were agitated and confrontational when asking questions about your TA funding. A librarian reported that you seemed unusually upset when discussing your Carroll reassignment, and a faculty member expressed concern about what they described as defensive and hostile responses during a departmental seminar." I sat there processing the audacity of what was happening. They had retaliated against me by removing my funding, reassigning my library space, and creating obstacles to my academic progress. When I questioned these actions or expressed frustration about obvious mistreatment, they documented my entirely reasonable responses as evidence of psychological instability. "Let me understand this," I said. "You removed my TA funding without justification, moved me to a basement Carroll with no internet access, and are blocking my dissertation defense. When I ask questions about these decisions or express frustration about being treated unfairly, you're pathologizing my responses as concerning behaviors." Chin leaned forward with the kind of practiced sympathy that mental health professionals use when they're about to recommend involuntary intervention. Graduate school can be overwhelming, she said, especially when students are dealing with interpersonal stressors and academic pressures. Sometimes people develop coping strategies that aren't healthy or productive. We're worried that you might be experiencing some difficulty with emotional regulation that could benefit from professional support. Emotional regulation, I repeated. Dr. Chin, my emotional regulation is fine. What I'm experiencing is systematic retaliation for reporting racial discrimination. Are you suggesting that responding to institutional racism with anything other than complete compliance indicates a mental health problem? Dean Walsh intervened. No one is suggesting you have mental health problems. We're just concerned about some patterns we've observed and want to make sure you have resources for managing stress in healthier ways. What patterns? I demanded. Be specific. Dr. Hayes consulted his notes again. Multiple community members have reported that you seem angry or defensive when discussing your experiences here. You've been fixated on what you perceive as discriminatory treatment rather than focusing on moving forward positively. And you've been resistant to suggestions for resolving conflicts constructively. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking. I was being pathologized for accurately identifying racism, for refusing to accept gaslighting about my experiences, and for declining to participate in fake reconciliation processes that would have required me to pretend discrimination hadn't occurred. Dr. Hayes, I said, let me make sure I understand your logic. When my white roommate makes a false report to campus security based on racist assumptions, that's an interpersonal conflict. When I accurately name it as racial discrimination, that's fixation and defensiveness. When you retaliate against me for reporting racism, that's normal administrative processes. When I question retaliation, that's concerning behavior that requires psychological intervention. Is that correct? None of them responded directly, but Dr. Chen tried a different approach. What we're really concerned about is your academic success. When students are dealing with unresolved trauma or stress, it can impact their ability to perform at their highest level. We want to make sure you have support for processing these difficult experiences so they don't interfere with your degree completion. My academic performance has been excellent throughout this entire situation, I replied. My research is on schedule, my comprehensive exams were passed with distinction, and my dissertation proposal was unanimously approved. What specific academic performance issues are you concerned about? More silence. They couldn't point to any academic problems because there weren't any. This wasn't about my well-being or academic success. It was about manufacturing a justification for removing a student who had refused to accept racist treatment quietly. Dean Walsh tried one final manipulation. We're really trying to help you succeed here, but we need you to work with us. Dr. Chen has recommended some counseling sessions that could help you develop better strategies for managing stress and interpersonal challenges. We're also exploring some alternative academic pathway options that might be less stressful for you to complete. Alternative academic pathway options, I asked. Are you suggesting I transfer to a different program or leave the university? We're just exploring all options for supporting your success, Dr. Hayes said. Sometimes a change of environment can be beneficial when students are struggling with ongoing conflicts. I stood up and gathered my materials. Let me be absolutely clear about what's happening here. You are attempting to use psychological pathologizing as a weapon against a student who reported racial discrimination. You are suggesting that my accurate perception of racism indicates mental health problems requiring intervention. And you are floating the idea of removing me from my program as a solution to your inability to address institutional racism appropriately. Dr. Chen tried one last intervention. We're really just concerned about your well-being. No, I interrupted. You're concerned about your institutional liability. You're worried that I might take legal action or make your discrimination problems public. So you're trying to create a paper trail that suggests I'm psychologically unstable and academically struggling, hoping that will undermine my credibility if I file complaints or lawsuits. The room fell silent. I had named exactly what they were doing and they couldn't deny it without lying outright. I will not be accepting counseling for the crime of recognizing racism, I continued. I will not be considering alternative academic pathways because you're uncomfortable with accountability, and I will not be allowing you to rewrite my experience of discrimination as a mental health problem. I headed toward the door, then turned back for one final statement. You have systematically retaliated against me for reporting racial discrimination. You have attempted to gaslight me about my own experiences, and now you're trying to pathologize my reasonable responses to institutional racism. You've created excellent documentation of discriminatory treatment that will be very useful in legal proceedings. As I left the building, I immediately called Dr. Moore to update her on what had happened. They just handed you everything you need for a discrimination lawsuit, she said. They're so committed to protecting their racist narrative that they're willing to put their discriminatory reasoning in writing. That evening, I sat down and wrote a detailed account of the meeting, including exact quotes and specific details about their attempts to pathologize my responses to racism. I was exhausted by the constant fighting, hurt by the betrayal of an institution I'd trusted, and angry about the time and energy being stolen from my important research. But I was also energized by clarity about what needed to happen next. They had escalated this conflict beyond the point where quiet resolution was possible. They had made it clear that they would never acknowledge what they'd done or take appropriate corrective action voluntarily. It was time to stop playing by their rules and start playing by mine. Because while they'd been busy trying to gaslight and intimidate me, I'd been building a case that would force them to confront their own racism whether they wanted to or not. The final straw came when they tried to destroy my academic reputation publicly, miscalculating how much community support I had built and how well documented their pattern of retaliation had become. 3 weeks after the psychological evaluation ambush, I received an email from Dr. Hayes informing me that my department had voted to place me on academic probation due to concerns about professional behavior and community engagement. The letter cited my inability to resolve interpersonal conflicts constructively, my resistance to administrative guidance, and my negative impact on departmental climate. Academic probation would prevent me from defending my dissertation, suspend my eligibility for any university funding, and create a permanent record that would destroy my chances for academic employment. Most devastating, it would require me to meet monthly with an academic advisor to demonstrate improvement in professional behavior and attitude before being allowed to continue in the program. The cruelty was breathtaking. They were essentially requiring me to perform gratitude for discriminatory treatment and demonstrate that I had learned to accept racism gracefully before allowing me to complete my degree. But they made a critical error in their timeline. The vote to place me on academic probation had supposedly occurred during a departmental faculty meeting that I knew had been canceled due to low attendance. When I requested documentation of the meeting minutes and voting records, Dr. Hayes claimed that personnel discussions were confidential and couldn't be shared with students. That's when I knew they had manufactured the entire probation decision. There had been no faculty vote, no departmental discussion, no legitimate academic justification for probation. They had simply fabricated an official-sounding action to create legal justification for removing me from the program. I immediately reached out to Dr. Patricia Williams, a faculty member in the African American Studies Department who had been supporting students of color facing institutional racism. When I shared the probation letter with her, she was furious but not surprised. They did the same thing to Amara Johnson 2 years ago, she told me. He reported a racist incident with a faculty member. They retaliated systematically, and when he wouldn't quit voluntarily, they manufactured academic performance issues to justify removing him. He transferred to another university to finish his degree, but the damage to his career trajectory was permanent. Dr. Williams connected me with the Coalition for Racial Justice in Higher Education, a network of faculty, students, and community advocates who documented and challenged institutional racism at universities across the Southeast. Through them, I learned that UNC had a documented pattern of retaliating against students of color who reported discrimination, using academic probation and manufactured behavioral concerns as weapons against anyone who challenged racist treatment. More importantly, the coalition had been waiting for someone with my credentials and documentation to build a legal case that could force systematic change rather than just individual remedies. My situation was particularly strong because I had maintained excellent academic performance throughout the retaliation campaign, had documented every interaction meticulously, and had community support that could verify the discriminatory pattern. The coalition's legal team, led by civil rights attorney Dr. Angela Davis Thompson, reviewed my documentation and was amazed by the thoroughness of evidence I had collected. Most discrimination cases rely on he said, she said testimony, she explained. But you have emails, meeting notes, policy documents, witness statements, and a clear timeline that shows systematic retaliation for protected activity. This is exactly the kind of case that can force institutional accountability. We decided to go public with a coordinated strategy that would put maximum pressure on the university while building support for systematic policy changes. The plan had 3 components: legal action, media exposure, and community mobilization. First, we filed a formal discrimination complaint with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, documenting not just my case but the pattern of retaliation against students of color that the coalition had been tracking for years. The complaint requested a federal investigation of UNC's policies and practices regarding discrimination reporting, student disciplinary procedures, and retaliation prevention. Simultaneously, we filed a federal lawsuit under Title VII and Section 1983, seeking damages for the discrimination I had experienced and injunctive relief requiring UNC to implement systematic reforms to prevent future retaliation against students reporting racism. The media strategy was coordinated through the coalition's communications team, which had relationships with journalists who covered civil rights issues in higher education. We reached out to reporters at the Chronicle of Higher Education, the local NBC affiliate, and the state NAACP newsletter to tell my story as part of a broader investigation into institutional racism at UNC. Most importantly, we organized a community response that demonstrated how my individual case connected to broader struggles for racial justice. The coalition organized a rally on campus where students, faculty, staff, and community members could hear directly from students of color who had experienced similar retaliation for reporting racism. The day before the rally, Dean Walsh called to schedule an emergency meeting to discuss resolving this situation before it escalates unnecessarily. I agreed to meet with her, but brought Dr. Thompson and Dr. Williams as advocates, making it clear that any conversation would be documented and that I was no longer interested in private negotiations that protected the university's reputation at my expense. Dean Walsh began the meeting with what was clearly a prepared speech about the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion. "We've always taken discrimination seriously," she said, "and we want to make sure any misunderstandings are cleared up quickly so we can all move forward positively." Dr. Thompson interrupted immediately. "Dean Walsh, let's be clear about what we're discussing. Miss Johnson didn't experience misunderstandings. She experienced systematic racial discrimination and retaliation. We're not here to negotiate about whether discrimination occurred. We're here to discuss what the university is prepared to do to remedy the violations and prevent future incidents." "Well, we're certainly open to discussing ways to address Miss Johnson's concerns," Dean Walsh replied. "Perhaps we could explore some kind of accommodation that would allow her to complete her degree without ongoing stress about these interpersonal challenges." "Accommodation?" I asked. "Dean Walsh, I don't need accommodation for experiencing racism. I need the university to acknowledge what happened, take corrective action against the people who discriminated against me, and implement policy changes to protect other students from similar treatment." Dr. Williams added, "The academic probation decision needs to be reversed immediately and expunged from Ms. Johnson's record. The faculty members who participated in retaliation need bias training and formal reprimands, and the university needs to implement an independent oversight process for discrimination complaints so administrators can't investigate themselves anymore." Dean Walsh's demeanor shifted as she realized this wasn't going to be the quiet negotiation she had anticipated. "Those are very significant requests," she said. "I'm not sure we can commit to specific personnel actions or policy changes without broader administrative review. Then we'll let the federal investigators and the courts handle the broader administrative review," Dr. Thompson replied. "We filed our complaint yesterday, and the media will be covering this story starting tomorrow. This isn't a private matter anymore. It's a public accountability process." The color drained from Dean Walsh's face. Media coverage, was that really necessary? "We're trying to handle this internally and constructively." "You had months to handle this internally and constructively," I said. "Instead, you chose to protect racism, gaslight the victim, and manufacture academic problems to justify retaliation. You made this a public matter when you decided to defend discrimination rather than address it." The meeting ended with Dean Walsh saying she would need to discuss our demands with university legal counsel and get back to us. But the damage was done. She now understood that the quiet removal strategy had failed and that the university was facing public scrutiny of its discrimination policies. That evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just hope for my individual situation, but hope that this fight might actually create changes that would protect other students of color from experiencing what I had endured. The rally the next day drew over 200 people, including students who shared their own stories of institutional racism, faculty members who admitted they had witnessed discrimination without intervening effectively, and community leaders who connected campus racism to broader patterns of institutional violence against Black people. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces that represented solidarity and support rather than hostility and gaslighting, I felt the power of community that my grandmother had taught me about, the collective strength that had carried Black people through centuries of systemic oppression. They thought they could make me disappear quietly, I told the crowd. They thought that if they just made my life difficult enough, I would leave voluntarily and they could continue protecting racism without consequences. But they didn't understand that I come from people who never gave up fighting for dignity and justice, and I have no intention of being the first one in my family to back down when facing institutional racism. The crowd's response was electric, and I knew that regardless of what happened in the legal proceedings, we had already won something important. We had refused to let them define the narrative, refused to accept their gaslighting about what had happened, and refused to disappear quietly while they continued harming other students who looked like me. Justice came faster than anyone expected, partly because the university's legal team realized immediately that they were in an indefensible position, and partly because the media attention created political pressure that made quiet settlement impossible. Within 2 weeks of filing our federal complaint, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights notified UNC that they were launching a comprehensive investigation of the university's discrimination policies and practices. The investigation would examine not just my case, but the pattern of retaliation against students of color that our documentation had revealed. The media coverage was more extensive than we had anticipated. The Chronicle of Higher Education featured my story as part of a broader investigation into institutional racism in graduate programs across the Southeast. The local NBC affiliate did a 3-part series on discrimination in higher education that included interviews with other students who had experienced similar retaliation. Most importantly, the state NAACP picked up the story and began organizing broader community pressure for systematic changes at UNC. The real breakthrough came when Dr. Moore received a call from someone we hadn't expected, Dr. James Morrison, a white faculty member in the epidemiology department who had been on my dissertation committee before mysteriously developing concerns about the current environment. Dr. Morrison asked to meet with me privately, and when we sat down in his office, he looked genuinely ashamed. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Dr. Hayes approached me 6 weeks ago and asked me to delay your dissertation defense. He said you were experiencing behavioral problems related to a housing conflict and that it would be better to wait until you had gotten psychological support." "Did you believe him?" I asked. "I should have questioned him more," he admitted. "Your academic work has been exemplary, and I had no direct knowledge of any behavioral problems, but Hayes made it sound like a temporary delay that would be better for your long-term success." I realize now that I was manipulated into participating in retaliation against you. Dr. Morrison's willingness to acknowledge his role and provide documentation of how the university had manipulated faculty members into participating in retaliation was the smoking gun our legal team needed. He agreed to provide a written statement detailing exactly what Dr. Hayes had told him and acknowledging that there had been no legitimate academic justification for delaying my defense. More faculty members began coming forward with similar stories. Professor Jennifer Walsh admitted that she had been told by Dean Walsh to keep an eye on my adjustment to the program and to gently suggest alternative options if I seemed to be struggling. The librarian who had moved my Carol revealed that she had been instructed by administrators to relocate me for security reasons that were never explained. The university's own faculty and staff were providing evidence that the administration had orchestrated a systematic campaign of retaliation while lying to community members about the justifications for their actions. 3 weeks after our complaint was filed, Dr. Thompson received a call from UNC's legal counsel requesting a settlement meeting. The university was ready to negotiate rather than face a federal investigation and ongoing media scrutiny that was damaging their reputation and creating political problems with state legislators. The settlement meeting took place in a conference room with university legal counsel Dean Walsh, Dr. Hayes, and the university's president, Dr. Margaret Foster. President Foster began by acknowledging that mistakes had been made and expressing the university's commitment to learning from this situation and doing better in the future. Dr. Thompson cut through the diplomatic language immediately. "President Foster, we're not here to discuss mistakes or learning opportunities. We're here to discuss systematic racial discrimination and retaliation that violated federal civil rights law. The question is whether UNC is prepared to take meaningful corrective action or whether we need to let federal investigators and a jury make those decisions." The university's settlement offer was comprehensive, demonstrating how seriously they were taking the legal and political pressure we had created. They agreed to remove the academic probation from my record and issue a formal letter acknowledging that it had been imposed without legitimate justification, restore my TA funding for the remainder of my program, and provide additional research support to help me complete my dissertation. Remove all negative documentation related to the discrimination complaint from my student file and provide positive letters of recommendation acknowledging my academic excellence and professionalism. Implement mandatory bias training for all administrators involved in student disciplinary processes. Create an independent ombudsman position to investigate discrimination complaints, removing the conflict of interest that had allowed administrators to investigate themselves. Establish a $50,000 scholarship fund for students of color in graduate programs, named in honor of civil rights activists who had fought institutional racism in higher education. Pay $75,000 in damages to me for the discrimination and retaliation I had experienced. Cover all legal fees and costs associated with the complaint and lawsuit, but the most important part of the settlement was the systemic changes they agreed to implement. UNC would revise their discrimination reporting policies to provide better protection for students filing complaints, create clear consequences for retaliatory behavior, and establish regular auditing of disciplinary actions to identify patterns of bias. They also agreed to participate in a 2-year monitoring program with the Coalition for Racial Justice in Higher Education, allowing external oversight of their progress in implementing anti-discrimination reforms. When President Foster signed the settlement agreement, she made a brief statement acknowledging that the university had failed to protect me from discrimination and expressing commitment to ensuring that similar incidents wouldn't happen to future students. But the real victory came 3 months later when I successfully defended my dissertation on structural racism and maternal mortality disparities, a multi-state analysis of healthcare access and outcomes. The defense was attended not just by my committee members but by dozens of students, faculty, and community members who had supported me throughout the legal battle. Dr. Moore introduced my defense by acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances under which I had completed my research. Amara Johnson has produced groundbreaking scholarship on structural racism while simultaneously fighting structural racism, she said. Her research will save Black women's lives, and her courage in challenging institutional discrimination will protect students of color for years to come. The defense went flawlessly. My research had uncovered clear evidence that structural racism in healthcare settings was directly contributing to maternal mortality disparities, and my policy recommendations had already been adopted by 3 state health departments. The committee voted unanimously to accept my dissertation and award my doctorate with highest honors. Standing in that room holding my PhD diploma, I thought about my grandmother's words about education being both weapon and shield. The weapon had been my research that would expose and help dismantle racist health policies. The shield had been my educational credentials that gave me the standing to challenge institutional racism without being dismissed as unqualified or incompetent. But the most powerful moment came during the celebration afterward when Sarah Mitchell, my former roommate who had started this entire ordeal, approached me at the reception. She looked uncomfortable and ashamed, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I wanted to apologize, she said. I've been in therapy and I'm starting to understand how my assumptions about you were rooted in racism. I know I can't undo the harm I caused, but I wanted you to know that I'm working to be better. I looked at her for a long moment, thinking about all the pain her racist assumptions had caused, all the months of fighting I'd had to endure, all the energy stolen from my important research by her decision to weaponize campus security against me. Sarah, I said finally, I appreciate your apology. The question now is what you're going to do with that awareness to make sure other Black students don't experience what you put me through. She nodded and walked away, and I never saw her again. But her apology, combined with everything else that had happened, felt like a closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The changes that followed extended far beyond my individual victory, creating ripple effects that protected other students and challenged institutional racism throughout the university system. Within 6 months of our settlement, the independent ombudsman position we had negotiated was handling discrimination complaints from students across multiple departments. Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez, the civil rights attorney hired for the position, reported that she was seeing patterns of retaliation and institutional gaslighting similar to what I had experienced, confirming that my case hadn't been isolated but part of systematic problems. The bias training program for administrators, initially resisted as bureaucratic burden, actually began changing how discrimination complaints were handled. Faculty members who participated reported that they had been unaware of how their responses to student concerns could inadvertently reinforce racial bias, and several requested additional training to better support students of color. Most importantly, the external monitoring program with the Coalition for Racial Justice created ongoing accountability that prevented the university from treating our settlement as a one-time crisis management exercise. The coalition published annual reports tracking UNC's progress on implementing anti-discrimination reforms, maintaining public pressure for continued improvement. The scholarship fund we had established grew beyond the initial $50,000 as alumni and community members contributed additional money to support students of color in graduate programs. More significantly, the scholarship included mentorship and advocacy training components that helped recipients navigate predominantly white academic spaces more successfully. My own transition from graduate student to professional academic was smoother than I had anticipated, partly because the media coverage of my case had raised my profile within public health circles, and partly because my research on maternal mortality disparities was generating significant policy interest. I accepted a tenure-track position at Spelman College where I could conduct my research within a supportive environment while training the next generation of Black women researchers. The position allowed me to continue my maternal health work while also developing a new research program examining institutional racism in higher education. The personal healing took longer than the professional recovery. Months after defending my dissertation, I was still hypervigilant about potential discrimination, still exhausted from years of fighting institutional racism, still processing the trauma of being systematically gaslit about my own experiences. Therapy helped, particularly working with Dr. Ava Williams, a Black psychologist who specialized in racial trauma and understood the specific challenges of recovering from institutional discrimination. She helped me process not just the individual incidents but the broader impact of being forced to fight for basic dignity while trying to complete my academic work. What you experienced was designed to break you, Dr. Williams explained during one of our sessions. Institutional racism doesn't just discriminate, it tries to make you question your own perceptions, doubt your own worth, and accept mistreatment as normal. The fact that you refuse to be broken is remarkable, but recovery from that kind of systematic assault takes time. The support of my family and community remained crucial throughout the healing process. Sunday dinners at Mama Ruth's house became celebrations of victory rather than strategy sessions for survival. But the cultural wisdom that had sustained me through the fight continued to ground me as I moved forward. My mother, who had watched the entire ordeal with a mixture of pride and pain, summed up the experience in terms that connected my individual struggle to our family's intergenerational journey. Baby, your great-grandmother cleaned houses so your grandmother could teach school. Your grandmother taught school so I could become a nurse. I became a nurse so you could become a doctor. And you became a doctor to save other Black women's lives. But what you did at that university, standing up to their racism and making them accountable, that's for all the granddaughters who haven't been born yet. 6 months after graduation, I received an unexpected email from Amara Johnson, the student Dr. Williams had mentioned, who had been forced out of UNC 2 years before my experience. He had learned about my case through the media coverage and wanted to thank me for fighting the battle he hadn't been able to win. Reading about your case was both painful and empowering, he wrote. Painful because it confirmed that what happened to me was part of a pattern, not just bad luck or misunderstanding. Empowering because you proved that they could be held accountable. I finished my degree at Howard and I'm now working in community health in Atlanta. Your victory made it possible for me to heal from what they did to me and move forward with my career. His email reminded me that individual victories against institutional racism create collective progress, that refusing to accept discriminatory treatment quietly opens doors for others who face similar challenges. The most satisfying update came a year later when Dr. Rodriguez, the ombudsman, reported that discrimination complaints were being resolved more quickly and fairly, that retaliation against students filing complaints had decreased significantly, and that the university's climate for students of color had measurably improved according to annual campus surveys. Dean Walsh had been reassigned to a position with no student contact after multiple complaints about her handling of discrimination cases. Dr. Hayes had left the university entirely after the faculty senate passed a no-confidence resolution regarding his retaliation against students. The institutional protection of racist behavior that had enabled my discrimination was being systematically dismantled. But the change that meant the most to me was hearing from current students of color who felt empowered to report discrimination because they knew there were now systems in place to protect them from retaliation. A graduate student named Jasmine Washington sent me a message through social media. Dr. Johnson, I wanted you to know that when my advisor made racist comments about my research, I reported it immediately because I knew about what you went through and how you fought back. The Ombudsman's office took it seriously, and my advisor is getting bias training. I didn't have to suffer in silence because you made sure future students would have protection. Reading her message, I felt the full weight of what we had accomplished. We had transformed one instance of racist treatment into systematic changes that would protect countless other students. We had refused to let institutional racism continue unchallenged, and we had created accountability where none had existed before. My grandmother always said that the measure of our success isn't just what we achieve for ourselves, but what we make possible for the people who come after us. Standing in my new office at Spelman, looking at my diploma and the newspaper clippings documenting our victory, I understood that we had honored that legacy. The fight against institutional racism is never finished, but we had won this battle decisively, and we had shown other people facing similar discrimination that victory was possible when they refused to accept injustice quietly. 3 years later, the impact of our victory continues to expand in ways we could never have anticipated when we first decided to fight back against institutional racism. The Coalition for Racial Justice in Higher Education has used our case as a model for challenging discrimination at universities across the Southeast. Our legal strategy, documentation methods, and community mobilization approach have been adapted to support students facing institutional racism at over 20 different universities. Dr. Thompson, the civil rights attorney who led our legal team, now runs workshops for students of color on Know Your Rights and Document Everything, teaching people how to build strong discrimination cases by maintaining detailed records of discriminatory treatment. The workshops always include my story as an example of how individual resistance can create systematic change. The Federal Office for Civil Rights Investigation that our complaint triggered expanded beyond UNC to examine discrimination patterns at other universities in the UNC system. The investigation led to consent agreements requiring anti-discrimination reforms at multiple campuses, protecting thousands of students who will never know that our individual fight made their educational experiences safer. But the personal impact has been equally transformative. My research on maternal mortality disparities has been cited in congressional hearings on racial health inequities, and the policy recommendations from my dissertation have been implemented by health departments in 8 states. The work I was able to complete because we fought for my right to remain in my program is now saving Black women's lives across the country. More importantly, the experience taught me that individual excellence, while necessary, is never sufficient to overcome systemic racism. The community support, legal advocacy, and collective organizing that made our victory possible demonstrated the power of coordinated resistance to institutional discrimination. I often think about Sarah, my former roommate, whose racist assumptions started this entire ordeal. I've heard through mutual acquaintances that she completed her psychology degree and now works in diversity and inclusion programming at a nonprofit organization. Whether her professional choices represent genuine transformation or just career opportunism, I'll never know. But the fact that she apologized suggests that confronting racism directly rather than accepting it quietly can sometimes educate perpetrators in ways that silent suffering never could. The scholarship fund we established has grown to over $200,000 and has supported 15 graduate students of color at UNC. Each recipient receives not just financial support, but also mentorship and advocacy training, ensuring that they have tools for navigating institutional racism and fighting back when necessary. Last month, I received an invitation to deliver the keynote address at UNC's annual diversity conference, an ironic twist that would have been unimaginable during the months when they were trying to force me out of the university. I accepted the invitation not because I had forgiven their institutional racism, but because I wanted to remind them that the changes we forced them to implement require ongoing vigilance and commitment. Standing at the podium where 3 years earlier they had tried to silence me, I spoke directly to the students of color in the audience. Institutional racism thrives on your silence, your self-doubt, and your isolation. It wants you to accept mistreatment as normal, to question your own perceptions when you experience discrimination, and to suffer quietly rather than demand accountability. Your refusal to comply with those expectations is how we create change. After my speech, dozens of students approached me with their own stories of discrimination, their own struggles with institutional gaslighting, their own fears about fighting back against powerful institutions. I listened to each story, provided resources and contact information for legal and advocacy support, and reminded them that they didn't have to face institutional racism alone. One young woman, a first year graduate student named Taylor, stayed until everyone else had left. Dr. Johnson, she said, I've been experiencing microaggressions from my advisor, but I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if it was really discrimination. Hearing your story helped me trust my own perceptions and realize that I have the right to expect better treatment. Trust your instincts, I told her. Document everything, build community support. And remember that accepting discrimination quietly doesn't protect you, it just makes it easier for them to continue discriminating against you and other students who look like us. Driving home from that conference, I thought about the journey from that Tuesday afternoon when Sarah called campus security on me to this moment when I was being celebrated by the same institution that had tried to destroy my academic career. The transformation wasn't magic, it was the result of strategic resistance, community support, and refusal to accept institutional racism as inevitable. My grandmother, Mama Ruth, passed away last year at 91, but not before seeing me graduate with my doctorate and knowing that our family's investment in education had paid off in ways that extended far beyond individual achievement. At her funeral, the pastor read from a letter she had written to be shared after her death. I lived to see my granddaughter become Dr. Amara Johnson, but more importantly, I lived to see her refuse to let racist people steal her dignity or derail her dreams. The greatest gift we can give our children is not just education, but the courage to fight for justice when education isn't enough. Amara fought that fight and she won it not just for herself, but for all the children who will come after her. Today, I carry that legacy forward in my research, my teaching, and my continued advocacy for students facing institutional discrimination. The fight against racism isn't one once and finished. It requires ongoing resistance, constant vigilance, and the willingness to confront discriminatory treatment whenever and wherever it occurs. But our victory proves something that sustains me through continued struggles. Institutional racism, no matter how sophisticated or well-funded, cannot survive sustained resistance from people who refuse to accept injustice quietly. When we document discrimination, build community support, and fight back strategically, we can force accountability and create changes that protect future generations. If you're facing institutional racism in your workplace, school, or community, remember this story. Remember that your individual experience connects to broader patterns of systemic discrimination. Remember that institutions count on your silence and isolation to continue their discriminatory practices. And remember that when you fight back with documentation, legal support, community organizing, and strategic pressure, you're not just fighting for yourself, but for everyone who will face similar challenges after you. The struggle continues, but our victory proved that the struggle can be won. And every time someone refuses to accept racist treatment quietly, every time someone documents discrimination and demands accountability, every time someone transforms individual resistance into collective action, we move closer to the world our ancestors envisioned when they invested everything in our education and our freedom. That's the power of refusing to disappear quietly when institutions try to silence you. That's the power of trusting your own perceptions when people try to gaslight you about discrimination. That's the power of community organizing when individual excellence isn't enough to overcome systemic racism. And that's why I'll never stop telling this story, never stop supporting students facing similar challenges, and never stop believing that justice is possible when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Subscribe to join the community of people who understand these struggles and are committed to creating change. Share your own stories in the comments. Your experiences matter. Your resistance matters, and your refusal to accept discrimination quietly makes all of our communities stronger and safer. The fight continues, but we've proven that the fight can be won.